Some people never cry for help. They simply fall asleep in the one place no one ever thinks to look. 1:53 in the morning, on the 40th floor rooftop of Kingsley Tower. The lounge had closed hours ago. 40 floors below, Chicago still burned bright and sleepless. Up here, after the chairs had been turned onto the tables and half the lights had gone dark, there was nothing left but the wind and the silence. Maren Cole sat curled on the last chair she hadn't yet cleared away. She had mopped the floor, stacked the chairs, locked the storeroom. She only meant to close her eyes for a minute before going down to fetch her things. But 14 hours on swollen feet left her no choice. Her head tipped against the back of the chair. A ring of keys dangled from her loosening fingers, and she slept. She never heard the glass door slide open behind her. The man stepped out carrying the cold of the night. Every night, after an entire city had lowered its voice at the sound of his name, this was the only place he came. No guards, no phone, no one who dared follow him up. This rooftop was his, the way nearly everything in the tower was his. Tonight, it was not empty. Raphael Vance stopped. The gaze that had once made the hardest men move to another seat now settled on a sleeping waitress. He was not used to anyone being in the one place meant to be his alone. He meant to turn back inside. He did not. The keys slipped from her hand and fell toward the stone floor. He crossed to her, bent down, and caught them before they could land. For a moment, the man the whole of Chicago quietly feared, stood, bowed over a sleeping waitress, holding her cheap ring of keys as if it mattered. He looked at her face exhausted even in sleep, the kind of weariness no single night could cure. Something very old stirred in his chest, something he believed he had buried long ago. He meant to wake her and tell her to leave. Instead, he sat down a few steps away and let her sleep. What Maren did not know was that the man sitting quietly in the dark did not merely own the tower she stood in, and what Raphael Vance did not expect was that this exhausted woman was about to reach the part of him he thought he had buried with his son. At 2:45, Maren stirred. Her eyes opened, and she realized she was not alone. If this story touched you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs the reminder that they are not alone. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story worth staying for. She sat up too quickly, her head still heavy because sleep hadn't had time to fade, her heart pounding as she realized there was a shadowed figure sitting in the darkness behind her. For one moment, she didn't know where she was. All she could see was the wide night sky above her, and the city lights blinking far below in the distance. Then everything came rushing back. The shift, the rooftop, the last chair she hadn't had time to clear away. And that stranger. She sprang up from the chair, her hand tightening around the ring of keys as if it were the only thing keeping her steady on her feet. Her voice turned hoarse with panic. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was still here. This area's closed already. I should have gone downstairs a long time ago." The man didn't move. He sat there with one leg crossed over the other, both hands resting calmly on the arms of the chair, composed, as though she were the one who had just stepped into his place and not the other way around. She couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, only a tall figure, broad shoulders, and a stillness that unsettled her more than shouting ever could have. "You don't get enough sleep." His voice sounded out, low and slow, not a question but an observation. Her legs were still trembling. She didn't understand why a stranger would speak to her in that tone, as though he already knew something about her. "I only meant to rest for a minute," she said, taking one step back toward the glass door. "I'll leave right away." "I'm sorry I disturbed you, sir." He tilted his head slightly, and the city lights threw a faint glow across half of his face. She didn't see the anger there that she had braced herself to face. "You've worked the night shift all week," he said. "And last week, too. You're always the last one to leave this floor." His words stopped her in the middle of her step. She looked at him, trying to search her memory for the face of a regular guest. Someone who had once sat at the bar. Someone she had served without noticing. She found nothing. She was certain she had never met this man before. And yet he spoke about her work schedule as if he were reading something he already knew by heart. "How do you know that?" she blurted out, then immediately regretted asking. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long while, his gaze neither probing nor threatening, just looking, as though he were weighing how much truth she deserved. "I notice many things in this building," he finally said. "That's my job." She didn't understand what that meant, and part of her didn't want to understand. There was something about this man that made her instincts tell her to leave as quickly as possible, but that same something held her in place for 1 second longer. She was used to powerful men walking into the lounge, Men who spent in one night more money than she could earn in half a year. This one was different. He displayed nothing, and yet the silence around him felt heavier than all of them put together. "I didn't mean to sleep here," she said softly, almost more to reassure herself than to explain. "I'm just tired." "I know," he replied. And this time, in those 2 brief words, she heard something she hadn't expected. Not pity, something closer to understanding, as though he too knew what it meant to be tired, in a way that no night of sleep could ever cure. She didn't know how to answer. The pager from her shift manager buzzed in the pocket of her apron, pulling her back into reality. She glanced down at the screen, then looked up again. "I have to go." He gave a single faint nod. "Be careful." She turned and walked quickly toward the glass door, her hand still gripping the ring of keys. Just as she was about to reach the door, she couldn't stop herself from looking back one more time. The man was still sitting in the same place, his back turned toward her, his face angled toward the glowing city, alone beneath the vast open sky, as though that were the only place in the world where he belonged. She stepped inside and let the sliding door close behind her. All the way down in the elevator, she couldn't push away the question that kept repeating in her mind. Who was that man? And why did he know so much about her when she didn't even know his name? Marin's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building on the west side of the city, where the elevator had been broken for a long time, and she had grown used to climbing the stairs even when her legs were almost too numb to feel. She got home when the sky was already beginning to pale toward morning, opened the door in the dark, and didn't turn on the light right away because she knew every hour of brightness meant money. She took off her server's shoes, set them neatly beside the door, then sat down on the edge of the bed for a long while without doing anything at all, only breathing. On the small kitchen table was a stack of papers she had tried not to look at for several days. She knew what was inside them. Numbers that never grew smaller, only larger with each passing month. Letters with bold print across the top of the page that she knew by heart so well she didn't need to open them to read them. 2 years earlier, she had once had a family, a home, a life she thought would last forever. Then, in a single night, all of it had been swept away, leaving behind an emptiness nothing could fill, and a debt she hadn't caused, but was the only one left to carry. She didn't allow herself to think too much about it. Thinking didn't pay off debt, and tears couldn't be exchanged for rent money. She had learned that, in the hardest way possible, that a person could hurt so much she thought she couldn't survive, yet still have to get up the next morning, still have to go to work, still have to smile at customers as though nothing inside her had broken. She managed to sleep for a few hours before daylight slipped through the thin curtain. Then she got up again, made a cup of weak coffee, ate something quickly just to get through the meal, and prepared for her afternoon shift. She worked 2 jobs, one at the lounge on the upper floor of Kingsley Tower at night, one at the diner near her home in the afternoon, and between those 2 shifts, she had almost no time that belonged to her alone. There were moments when she stood behind the counter, her mind empty from exhaustion to the point that she forgot where she was, forgot even what she had done 1 minute earlier, but she never let the customers see it. She had one rule she never broke, no matter how tired she was, no matter how humiliated she felt. She never begged anyone for anything. People had offered to help her before, with pitying eyes and conditions she didn't want to think about, and she had always refused. She would rather climb 3 flights of stairs on swollen feet than accept something that forced her to lower her head. Her pride was the last thing she had managed to keep after everything else had been taken from her, and she protected it as though she were protecting the last remaining human part of herself. Her coworkers at the lounge knew very little about her. They knew she worked hard, knew she never complained, knew she was always the one who stayed behind to clean up last. They didn't know how she got home, didn't know how she lived, and she preferred it that way. She had grown so used to loneliness that it no longer hurt her the way it once had. It had simply become part of her, quiet and familiar, like the ache settled deep in her bones. That night, as she stood wiping the last glasses before closing time, she caught herself thinking about the man on the rooftop. She didn't want to think about him. She told herself that a man like him and a woman like her didn't belong to the same world, that the encounter had only been a strange accident that would never happen again. But his words kept returning to her mind, the way he knew she was always the last one to leave the floor, the calm, deep voice that said he noticed many things in this building. She didn't understand why someone like that would notice someone like her, and she understood even less why that, instead of frightening her, stirred something inside her that she hadn't felt in a very long time, something almost like curiosity. And beyond that, something she didn't dare give a name. The highest floor of Kingsley Tower was a place very few people were allowed to enter, and those who were allowed understood that every time they stepped inside, they carried with them a certain degree of caution. Raphael Vance sat behind the long desk in his office at 9 o'clock in the morning. While most of the city was only beginning its workday, he had already finished dealing with matters no one else dared to touch. A middle-aged man in a dark suit stood before his desk, both hands clasped behind his back, his spine straight, though his eyes didn't dare meet Raphael's directly. The man was presenting a problem involving a sum of money that had gone missing from one of the establishments Raphael controlled, his voice growing smaller toward the end of each sentence, because he knew too well that in front of this man, every explanation became unnecessary. Raphael didn't interrupt. He let the other man finish speaking, then remained silent for long enough that the silence itself became a warning. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, only calm enough to chill the blood. And it was precisely that calmness that made the man across from him turn pale. He said he didn't care about the reason. He only cared that the money be returned to where it belonged before the end of the week, and that this was the last time he would hear about the matter. The man nodded over and over, thanked him, then backed out so quickly he nearly collided with the door. That was how Raphael's world operated. He rarely had to raise his voice, rarely had to give an order twice, because his name did most of the work for him. In the world he ruled, people spoke his name in lowered voices, not out of respect in the ordinary sense, but because of a fear rooted deep in them, the kind of fear reserved for a man ruthless enough to make others wary and intelligent enough never to leave a trace behind. He had built his position over many years, one step at a time, coldly and precisely, removing traitors, winning the loyalty of those who proved faithful, and turning a chaotic network into a smooth-running machine beneath a single hand. Kingsley Tower was only the visible part, the polished and legitimate shell concealing everything that flowed beneath it, and from the top of that tower, he looked down at the city like a man long accustomed to holding in his hands the things other people only dared to dream of. But that power couldn't buy him the one thing he wanted, and that was what none of the people who feared him knew. The world looked at him and saw a man who had everything. They didn't see that every night, when the machine stopped turning and the flatterers had gone, he returned to an emptiness that no amount of power could fill. He handled that day's work with his familiar sharpness, signing the documents that needed to be signed, making the phone calls that needed to be made, handing down decisions where even the smallest mistake could make an entire organization tremble. He did all of it without revealing the slightest emotion, because emotion was a luxury a man in his position wasn't allowed to have, and because he had learned to bury what he felt so deeply that sometimes he wondered whether he could still feel anything at all. And yet the night before, on the rooftop, something had stirred faintly inside him, something he couldn't explain. He didn't understand why the image of a waitress, who had fallen asleep in the last chair, had clung to him all day. Why, among the hundreds of people who passed through the tower every day, the only one he thought of was someone he barely knew. He had once made people disappear simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and yet with her, the first thing he thought about wasn't how to make her leave, but how to let her rest. He didn't like that feeling. It made him feel weaker. And in his world, weakness meant danger. But no matter how many times he told himself he should forget it, that an exhausted waitress had nothing to do with his life, he still found himself, when night fell, walking toward the glass door that led out to the rooftop, as though something up there was waiting for him to return. Dorian Slade was the night shift manager of the lounge, and he was the kind of man who only became pleasant when someone needed to ask him for something. He held the power to divide the tip money at the end of each shift, and he used that small authority like a weapon, keeping a portion for himself and distributing the rest in a way no one dared to challenge, because anyone who objected would find themselves assigned to the worst shifts the following week, or have their hours cut until they could no longer hold on and had to quit on their own. Most of the staff lowered their heads and let it pass, because like Marin, they needed this job more than they needed fairness. That night, just after the shift ended, Dorian called Marin back to the counter, holding the stack of tip money in his hand, and began counting it in front of her with a smile she had learned to be wary of. He said the lounge had been slow that night, that her share wasn't as much as usual, then pushed into her hand an amount far smaller than what she knew she had actually received from the guests, because she herself had served those guests, and she herself had seen how much they had left. She looked down at the money in her hand, then looked up at him, and instead of lowering her head and accepting it the way he expected, She placed the money back on the counter. She said, in a voice calm but clear, that she had served table 4 and table 9 all evening, that she knew exactly how much those guests had left, and that she only wanted to receive her rightful share, nothing more and nothing less. The smile disappeared from Dorian's face. He wasn't used to being answered back by a subordinate, especially not by a woman working 2 jobs who clearly needed every dollar. He lowered his voice, and in that voice was a threat that didn't need to be spoken outright. He reminded her that there were plenty of people willing to do her job, that she should know her place and not create trouble for herself, because she wasn't in any position to create trouble. Marin knew he was right about her circumstances. She needed this job. Losing it meant that debt would swallow her faster. But she also knew that if she lowered her head this time, there would be a next time, and another after that, until there was nothing of herself left to keep. She looked straight into his eyes, not raising her voice, not begging, only saying that she wasn't asking for anything extra. She was only asking for what she had earned, and if that was considered making trouble, then she no longer knew what fairness was supposed to be called. After she finished speaking, she didn't wait for him to answer. She took the exact amount she believed belonged to her, left the rest on the counter, then turned away to gather her things, her back straight, her steps not trembling at all, even though inside, her heart was beating very fast. What she didn't know was that the entire scene had not escaped the eyes of one man. At the far end of the hallway, leading into the private area, in the darkness where the lights couldn't reach, Raphael Vance stood silently, one hand tucked into his coat pocket, and he had witnessed everything from beginning to end. He didn't step out, didn't speak, only watched. And as he watched, he saw in that woman something he rarely saw in the people who surrounded him. Most people he met, when standing before power, even the petty little power of someone like Dorian, chose to bow their heads in order to stay safe. She didn't. She stood there, exhausted, poor, with nothing in her hands to protect herself, and yet she still refused to let anyone take what belonged to her, and she did it without needing to shout or shed a single tear. Raphael watched her shadow disappear behind the staff room door. Then his eyes shifted to Dorian, who was gathering the money back from the counter, with the resentful expression of a man who had just been stripped of something he believed was his. Something very cold appeared in Raphael's eyes at that moment. Something that, had Dorian seen it, would have kept him from sleeping peacefully that night. But Dorian didn't see it. He had no idea that he had just done something the most powerful man in this tower had silently remembered. The next morning, Dorian Slade received a call requiring him to go up to the highest floor of the tower, and he went there with the smugness of a man who believed he had caught the attention of those above him for good reasons. He didn't remain alone for long. When the office door closed behind him, he found himself standing before a man whose name he had only ever heard in whispers. A man even those many ranks above Dorian didn't dare mention casually. Raphael didn't invite him to sit. He let Dorian stand there in the middle of the spacious room, while he slowly set down the sheet of paper in his hand, and that silence stretched long enough for sweat to begin beading on Dorian's forehead, even though he still didn't understand what was happening. Then Raphael spoke, and he didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten him in the crude way Dorian used with his employees. He merely said that he knew about the tip money, knew how Dorian divided it, knew about the shifts that had been cut, and the veiled remarks used to make other people afraid. He named each thing one by one, with such precision that Dorian understood denying it would be meaningless, that this man had known everything before he ever called him up here. Dorian stammered as he searched for an explanation, trying to salvage himself by saying that it was only a method of management, that anyone in his position would do the same, but Raphael cut him off with a single sentence, saying that anyone who used his small little title to drain people who already had almost nothing didn't deserve to keep that title, and that in his tower, he didn't tolerate people who bullied those weaker than themselves. There was a coldness in that voice that made Dorian truly understand, for the first time in his life, what it meant to stand before someone who could decide his entire future without needing to raise his voice. He was told that from this moment on, he no longer worked at the lounge, that every dollar he had kept from the employees would have to be returned in full, and that if he tried to make things difficult for any of the people he had once pressured, he would face consequences he wasn't strong enough to imagine. Dorian left the office on trembling legs, with none of the smugness he had carried in when he entered, and he disappeared from the tower that very day. So quietly it was as though he had never existed there at all. Marin knew nothing about that meeting. The next evening, when she arrived at the lounge to prepare for her shift, The first thing she noticed was that the air in the staff area had changed. People whispered among themselves that Dorian had quit, that no one knew the exact reason, only that he had left suddenly and wouldn't be coming back. Then, at the end of the shift, when the tip money was divided, she received exactly her share, complete, without a single dollar missing, and along with it came a repayment for what had been withheld from her in the previous weeks, handed to her without a word of explanation. She stood there, holding the money in her hand, and a strange feeling rose inside her. She had grown so used to everything in her life only getting worse instead of better, so used to having to fight for every small thing that belonged to her, that when something good arrived on its own without requiring her to struggle, she didn't know how to believe in it. She asked a few co-workers who had decided this, and why Dorian had suddenly left, but no one could answer, or no one dared to answer. That night, as she stood wiping the last glasses the way she always did, her mind drifted back toward the rooftop, toward the man who sat alone in the darkness, toward the calm, deep voice that said he noticed many things in this building. She had no proof, no concrete reason to connect the two matters, and yet some instinct kept whispering inside her that this sudden change, this strange feeling of being able to breathe a little easier, was somehow connected to the man whose name she still didn't know. And the more she thought about it, the more her curiosity grew, growing so strong that she began to hope, even if only in secret, that she would see him once more. It took almost a week before she saw him again, and this time, she was the one who went up there on purpose, though she wouldn't admit that even to herself. She told herself she was only going to the rooftop to breathe a little air before going home, that after a long shift, standing there and looking out over the city for a few minutes was something perfectly normal. But deep down, she knew a part of her was hoping to see that shadowed figure sitting there again. And he truly was there, seated in the same place as before, his face turned toward the city lit bright beneath the night, as though he had never left that spot since the last time she had seen him. This time, she didn't startle. She stepped out, let the glass door slide closed behind her, then stood still for a moment, not knowing what to say. He was the one who spoke first. He didn't turn around, only said that she was once again the last person to leave this floor, and in his voice, she heard something almost like a faint trace of amusement. She answered that perhaps both of them had a habit of staying in places after everyone else had already gone, and she saw him tilt his head slightly, as though the sentence had touched something he hadn't expected. She moved a few steps closer, close enough that now she could see him more clearly in the light rising from the city. She still didn't know his name, still didn't know who he was, but she was no longer afraid of him in the way she had once been. Instead, she found herself watching him, studying every small detail, trying to piece them together into a picture of this man. She noticed the way he sat, his back straight but not rigid, the way his two hands rested quietly, the way his eyes looked far into the distance while seeming not to truly look at anything at all. She had met many powerful men in the lounge, and they all carried the same kind of energy, a loudness even when they were silent, a need to be noticed by others. This man was the opposite. He didn't need anyone to notice him. He seemed almost to want the world to leave him alone, and that was exactly what made her more curious than anything else. Without meaning to, she asked why he came up here every night, and the instant the question left her mouth, she was afraid she had crossed a line. He was silent for a long while, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, still without turning to look at her, that this was the only place in the entire building where no one needed anything from him, where no one was waiting for him to make a decision, where no one wanted to take something from him. The sentence was brief, but it revealed more than he had probably meant to say. And inside it, she heard a loneliness so deep, it made her pause. She had thought a man with power like his, a man the entire tower seemed to fear and respect, must have everything, must be surrounded by people who wanted to stand beside him. Yet sitting here in this moment, he looked more like a man who didn't have a single person to talk to than the owner of everything below. She realized, almost with a kind of quiet surprise, that perhaps he was lonely in the same way she was lonely, only his loneliness was hidden behind power, while hers was hidden behind work. She didn't say that out loud, because she knew there were some things that didn't need to be put into words. She only stood there with him a little longer. Two strangers from two completely different worlds, sharing a stretch of silence they both seemed to need. When her pager buzzed again, signaling that it was time for her to go, she hesitated for a moment before turning away. And this time, before stepping back inside, she stopped and told him that she hoped he would find someplace where he could truly rest, not only an empty rooftop at midnight. She didn't wait for him to answer. But when the glass door closed behind her, she had the feeling, though she didn't see it, that the man had just turned his head to watch her leave. In the days that followed, Raphael found himself thinking about her last words more than he wanted to admit. No one in all these years had ever said anything like that to him, that they hoped he would find some place where he could truly rest. People spoke to him about money, about power, about problems that needed solving, about men who needed to be dealt with, but no one had ever cared whether he was tired, whether he had any place at all where he could breathe. She had said that to him, a woman who owed him nothing, who had no reason to care, and she had said it not to flatter him, but simply because she truly thought it. He was so used to people being kind to him because they wanted something that kindness with no purpose attached to it left him unsure where to place it. He began to notice her in a different way, not with the cold attention of a man who controlled everything in the building, but with a kind of focus that felt unfamiliar even to him. He had someone look into her circumstances, discreetly, and what he learned left him silent. He learned about the 2 jobs she worked, about the distance she traveled each night to return to her apartment on the 3rd floor on the west side of the city, about the debt pressing down on her shoulders from a disaster 2 years earlier that she hadn't caused. He learned that she climbed 3 flights of stairs every night because the elevator was broken, that she had never once asked anyone for help, that she had refused offers many other people in her position would have seized with both hands. The more he learned, the more he saw in her something he had rarely encountered in his entire life. A self-respect that couldn't be bought, a resilience that didn't announce itself, a person from whom life had taken almost everything, yet who still refused to let it take her dignity. In his world, where anyone could be bought, bent, or broken by money or fear, a person like her was almost impossible to imagine. He decided to do something, and he did it in his own way, quietly, without letting her know. He had the long broken elevator in her building repaired, not through some grand, obvious command, but through a short call, a discreet arrangement made through channels no one could trace back to him. He didn't want her to know it was him. He didn't do it to be thanked. He did it because he couldn't bear the thought of her dragging her swollen feet up 3 flights of stairs every night after 14 hours of standing at work, when he, with a single word, could make that end. A few days later, he heard back through one of his people that the elevator was working again, that the people in that building didn't understand why the landlord had suddenly agreed to fix something that had been broken for so long, and that a woman on the 3rd floor had stood there looking at the lit elevator for a long while as though she couldn't believe her eyes. When he heard that, something very rare appeared on his usually cold face. Not exactly a smile, but a faint softening at the corners of his eyes. He didn't fully understand what was happening to him. He only knew that it had been a very long time since he had done something for another person, without calculating the benefit, without weighing what he would gain, without seeing it as a move on a board. And the simple act of making one person's life a little easier to breathe, without needing her to know, without needing anyone to know, gave him a feeling he had thought he would never be able to feel again. That night, when he went up to the rooftop and didn't find her there, he realized, with a kind of uneasiness he wasn't used to, that he was waiting. For the first time in many years, there was someone whose presence made his long nights feel a little less empty, and he didn't know whether he should be glad or afraid because of it. There was a reason Raphael chose this rooftop, and not any other place in his vast tower, a reason he had never told anyone and perhaps never would. Many years earlier, when Kingsley Tower was still being completed, he had once brought his son up here one afternoon, a little boy of about 4 with messy hair and a smile that could melt even the most stubborn ice inside him. The child's name was Eli, and Eli loved heights in the way only children can love them, without a trace of fear, filled only with clear, bright delight. He still remembered that afternoon vividly. He remembered the way the boy ran along the empty rooftop with both arms stretched wide, pretending to be an airplane, his mouth making the rumbling engine sounds he had invented himself. He remembered the way he himself, the man whose name made an entire city hold its breath, had run after his son, pretending to be a second airplane, until father and child were both laughing so hard they could barely breathe. He remembered the boy pointing down at the city below, and asking whether all those lights were stars that had fallen to the earth. And he remembered that he hadn't had the heart to tell his son they were only streetlights, so he had said yes, they were stars, and his son had looked at him with eyes shining with the absolute faith of a child who believed his father knew everything in the world. He remembered lifting the boy onto his shoulders so he could see farther, remembered the small, warm weight of his son against his neck, remembered those tiny hands clutching his hair, and remembered the sound of the boy's laughter ringing through the afternoon wind. The sound he had believed, in that moment, he would get to hear for the rest of his life. He had been wrong. Life, which was never fair to anyone, not even to the most powerful men, had taken that son from him when the boy was still far too young, taken him in a way that Raphael, with all his money and power and connections that could buy nearly anything in the world, still couldn't stop. And that was what had broken something inside him that never healed. His wife, unable to bear the grief and unable to bear the man he became after that loss, left not long afterward, leaving him alone in a penthouse so large that every footstep echoed back, alone with a silence heavier than any burden he had ever carried. From then on, he couldn't stand being inside that home at night, where every corner reminded him of everything he had lost. And every night, when the machine stopped turning, he would find himself walking toward this rooftop, the only place where he still felt close to his son, the place where, if he closed his eyes and let the wind pass over him, he could still hear a child's laughter drifting back from an afternoon that had long since disappeared into the distance. He came up here not to pray, because he had forgotten how to pray long ago, and not to cry, because he no longer had tears left to cry. He came up here only to remain near that memory a little longer, to remind himself that there had once been a time when he was a father who knew how to laugh, who knew how to run after his child across a rooftop and pretend to be an airplane, not only a man the whole city had to fear. That was the part of himself he thought he had buried with his son. The gentle part. The part that knew how to love. The part he had locked away behind so many layers of coldness because he couldn't survive losing anything one more time. And then one night, on this very rooftop, he stepped outside and found a woman asleep in the last chair, carrying on her face an exhaustion and a loneliness he recognized at once because he carried them himself every day, and for reasons he couldn't understand. In the moment he stood there watching her sleep beneath the night sky, he felt that part inside him, the part he had thought was dead, stir faintly for the first time in all those years, as if something buried deep beneath a layer of ashes had suddenly begun to grow warm again. The night they met again on the rooftop, something between them had changed. Perhaps it was because she had sensed the loneliness in him the last time, or perhaps because he himself, after everything that had come back to life inside him, no longer raised his familiar wall as firmly as he always had. They sat beside each other, not too close, both looking out at the city, and this time she was the one who broke the silence. She told him that she knew what it felt like to lose someone she had believed would stay beside her forever, and she said it not to probe into him, but only because, for reasons she couldn't understand, she felt this man would understand. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she didn't see the guardedness she had once seen. She saw only a quiet waiting, as though he were allowing her to continue, and she did. She told him that 2 years earlier, she had once had a family, had once had people she loved more than herself, and that in a single night, all of them had been swept out of her life by a tragedy she still couldn't think about without feeling her chest tighten. She didn't tell him the details, because there were kinds of pain that didn't grow lighter when spoken of in detail, but only tore the wound open again. And he didn't ask, because he understood that better than anyone. She said that after that night, she had not only lost the people she loved, but had also been left with an enormous debt she hadn't created, though she was the only one still alive to carry it, and that from then on, her life had become nothing but one shift after another, dollars counted over and over, nights spent returning home in the dark to save every small bit of electricity. She said there had been times when she wondered why she still kept trying, why she didn't simply give up and be done with it, but then she always found a reason to get up the next morning, even when that reason was sometimes nothing more than the fact that she refused to let life defeat her completely. He listened to her from beginning to end, without interrupting once, without offering any of the empty comfort people usually give when they don't know what else to say. And when she finished, he didn't say he was sorry, didn't say everything would be all right, because he knew those words meant nothing to someone who had been through what she had been through. Instead, he said softly that he understood. And that single word, coming from the mouth of a man she knew would never say something he didn't truly mean, carried more weight than all the words of comfort she had heard over the past 2 years. She looked at him, and in that moment she realized that the man sitting beside her was carrying a wound much like her own, a loss he also couldn't put into words, and that was why, from the very beginning, she had felt he was different from everyone else. They didn't need to tell each other every detail. They didn't need to discover some strange thread linking their pasts together. They were simply two people from whom life had once taken the most precious thing. And they had recognized that in each other. And that recognition itself created between them a bond that no words needed to confirm. That night, after she left, he remained seated alone for a very long time. And for the first time, he admitted to himself that this woman had become important to him in a way he had never expected. He, the man who had spent many years building a wall around himself that no one could pass through, the man who had carefully kept everyone from coming close enough to hurt him again, had now allowed someone in, and in his world, where every attachment could be turned by his enemies into a weakness, the fact that he had begun to change because of one person, the fact that he had revealed there was someone he was willing to protect, was the most dangerous thing he could do. He knew that. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt there was something worth risking. For many weeks, Raphael had carried a feeling he couldn't shake. The kind of feeling anyone who survived long enough in his world learned never to ignore, the feeling that something was wrong beneath the quiet surface of everything. At first, it was only small details, so small that a less careful man would have overlooked them. A shipment arrived later than usual with no explanation anyone could give to his satisfaction. A meeting he had arranged was leaked before it took place, though only a very small number of people knew about it. A few figures in the ledgers didn't match in a way too subtle to be an accidental mistake. Each incident on its own could have been explained by carelessness or bad luck, but Raphael didn't believe in coincidence. And when those small details began repeating in a pattern that only the eyes of a man who had spent his whole life recognizing patterns could see, he understood that he was facing something far more dangerous than someone's incompetence. He understood that someone was moving in the dark, someone intelligent enough to hide his tracks, patient enough to wait for the right moment, and most importantly, close enough to him to know things only an insider could know. That was what chilled him most. A threat from the outside he could handle. He had handled threats like that his entire life, and had never lost. But a threat from within, someone who had sat at the same table with him, someone he had trusted, someone who knew how he thought and how he made decisions. A person like that was dangerous in an entirely different way. He began watching the people around him with new eyes, quietly taking note of every reaction, every glance, every unnecessary moment of hesitation. He told no one about his suspicions, because he knew the traitor, whoever it was, must be watching to see whether he had noticed, and his only advantage now was making that person believe he still knew nothing. He thought back to Dorian Slade, the manager he had removed for bullying the staff, and an idea suddenly rose in his mind, one he couldn't yet confirm but couldn't dismiss either. He wondered whether a small, ordinary man like Dorian, someone only skilled at intimidating those weaker than himself, had truly acted entirely alone, or whether behind his recklessness stood someone bigger, someone who had indulged him, someone who had used him as a pawn in a game Dorian himself wasn't even capable of understanding. Raphael had no proof of that, only instinct, but his instinct had been sharpened by too many years for him to take it lightly. He felt, with a clarity so strong it was almost tangible, that those small incidents, Dorian's disappearance, and something larger hiding behind all of it were pieces of the same picture, a picture he had not yet seen in full. And that picture, he sensed, was leading toward a conspiracy larger than anything he had ever faced. A conspiracy not meant to take his money or his territory, but to take everything, to pull him down from the position he had spent his entire life building. That night, when he went up to the rooftop, he stood there alone in the cold wind, looking down at the city glowing beneath him, and for the first time, in a very long time, he felt something he had thought he had forgotten how to feel. Not fear for himself, because he had lived in danger too long to still be afraid for his own sake. It was a vague, unfamiliar, uncomfortable worry that the storm drawing near, when it finally broke, might not sweep away only him. The man behind it all was a man named Lucan Brandt, Raphael's longtime right hand, the one who had stood beside him through so many seasons of rise and ruin, and who had been trusted so deeply that almost no one in the organization ever thought to suspect him. Lucan had been with Raphael from the earliest days. He had watched him build everything from nothing, had helped him eliminate rivals and strengthen his power, and because of that, he understood Raphael better than anyone else still alive. But that understanding, the very thing that should have been the foundation of loyalty, became the seed of betrayal. For years, Lucan had quietly nurtured the belief that he was the one who deserved to sit in the highest position, that his contributions had never been properly repaid, that he had done most of the heavy work while Raphael was the one who received all the glory. Then Raphael's son died, and Lucan, watching his boss from the closest distance, saw something he had long been waiting for, without daring to hope. He saw Raphael change. He saw the man who had once left no opening at all, now disappear every night onto an empty rooftop. He saw the cold sharpness of the past, sometimes replaced by distant, wandering moments, and Lucan convinced himself that Raphael had grown weak, that grief had worn down the terrifying man he used to be, that now, at last, the time had come for him to seize what he believed was his. He spent many months preparing, placing his people in key positions, gathering what he needed, patiently weaving a conspiracy he believed Raphael, in his weakened state, wouldn't recognize until it was too late. But Lucan, no matter how clever he was, had made one mistake in his calculations. He believed that losing his child had made Raphael weaker, while the truth was far more complicated than that. And then, while watching Raphael more closely than ever as he waited for the right moment to strike the decisive blow, Lucan discovered something he immediately understood was worth more than everything else he had gathered. He discovered that the man who had no weakness now had one. Through his people, through discreet observation, Lucan realized that Raphael no longer spent every night on the rooftop alone the way he once had, that a woman had entered those lonely nights, a waitress who worked in the very lounge inside the tower. He saw the way Raphael changed around her, saw how he had quietly moved to remove Dorian because of her, saw even how he had silently arranged to repair an elevator on the west side of the city without any official order ever being given. To a predator like Lucan, those signs said everything. He understood that this woman, though she herself knew nothing of it, had become the most precious thing to Raphael since the loss of his son, and that if there was any way to break a man who seemed impossible to break, it did not lie in attacking his empire, but in attacking the heart he had only just allowed to open again. A cold smile appeared on Lucan's face when he realized he had found the leverage he needed. He wouldn't hurry. He would use her as a pawn, as a way to control Raphael, as a way to force that powerful man to choose between his empire and the woman he had made the mistake of caring for. And Lucan was certain that no matter which path Raphael chose, he would be the one who won. What Lucan never accounted for, what his arrogance had blinded him to, was that he had completely misjudged what a man like Raphael would do when the last thing left in the world that he loved was threatened. It began with small things, small enough to unsettle Marin, but not enough for her to understand what was happening. One evening, when she came out of the tower after her shift, she had the feeling that someone was following her, a cold sensation along her spine that made her turn back again and again on the way home. But every time she looked over her shoulder, all she saw were empty streets and shadows with no clear shape. She told herself she was only too tired, that her imagination was playing tricks on her. But a few days later, a man she had never met approached her while she was standing at the bus stop, and he spoke to her in a tone so polite it chilled her blood, calling her by her correct name, mentioning the third-floor apartment where she lived, mentioning both jobs she worked, as if to let her know that he understood her life down to every detail. He didn't threaten her directly, didn't say a single thing that could be taken as a clear warning, but everything in the way he stood, the way he looked at her, the way he said she should be careful about the people she allowed into her life, made her understand that this was a warning. She went home that night with both hands trembling, locked the door tightly, and sat in the dark for a long time, unable to understand why this was happening to her. She had lived the past 2 years as quietly as she possibly could, trying not to draw anyone's attention, trying only to focus on surviving one day at a time. And yet now, suddenly, there were strangers who knew everything about her, who followed her, who warned her about things she didn't understand. In the days that followed, the pressure kept increasing. She received calls from unlisted numbers, with only silence on the other end before the line went dead. She discovered that her debt, the things she had struggled to pay back little by little, had suddenly been bought by some outside party, and the terms that had already been harsh now became even more severe in a way she knew was not normal, as though someone were deliberately tightening a rope around her throat. She began to understand, though she still didn't know the whole truth, that none of this was accidental, that some invisible hand was pulling the strings behind it all, turning her already difficult life into something almost unbearable. And what hurt her most, what kept her awake night after night, was that she didn't understand what she had done to deserve it. She wasn't powerful. She had no money, no enemies, nothing that should have made anyone want to target her. She was only a woman trying to get through each day, carrying a debt she hadn't created, trying to hold on to the last small piece of dignity she still had left. And yet now, it seemed her very life was being targeted by a force she couldn't see, and she had no way at all to protect herself. She thought about going to the police, but she had nothing specific to report. No clear threat, no proof beyond her own fear, and she knew that people like her, poor and alone, and with no one standing behind them, were usually not the ones this world chose to listen to. For the first time since the tragedy 2 years earlier, she felt as though she was touching bottom again, the bottom she had believed she would never have to return to. She had lost her family, had lost almost everything, had rebuilt her life from fragments with every bit of strength she had left, and now even that fragile life was being threatened by something she didn't understand and couldn't control. And inside that terrible fear, one thought kept returning to her mind, a thought that both comforted her and confused her, that the only person in the world she felt might be able to protect her was the mysterious man on the rooftop, the man she still didn't fully know for who he truly was. In the long nights that followed, Marin lay awake and began thinking about something she hadn't thought about since rebuilding her life in this city: leaving. She had pieced together enough of the scattered fragments to understand a truth that made her heart twist, that the danger falling upon her had nothing to do with who she was, but with the man on the rooftop, with the bond growing between them, with the fact that she had allowed someone like him to step into her life. She didn't know who he truly was, but she understood enough to know that his world was a dangerous one, a world she didn't belong to, and that because she had come close to him, she had become a target. That thought tormented her. One part of her, the part that had grown used to protecting itself by never letting anyone come too close, urged her to do what she had always done whenever life became too dangerous: gather the few things she owned and disappear, go to another city, begin again from nothing one more time, cut every tie before it had the chance to drag her under. She had done it before. She knew she could do it again, and a voice inside her kept repeating that it was the only wise thing to do, that staying would bring only disaster, that she had no right to pull anyone else into the swamp of her life. But there was one thing that made her hesitate, one thing she hadn't expected and didn't know how to handle. For the first time after 2 long years, she didn't want to leave. For the first time since losing everything, there was someone who made her feel she wasn't completely alone in this world. Someone whose presence made her long nights feel less cold. Someone who saw her not as an exhausted waitress or a miserable debtor, but as a person with worth, someone deserving of respect, deserving of care. And that rare, precious thing, the very thing she had not dared hope she would ever find again, was now the thing she had to consider giving up. She was torn between 2 choices, and with every night that passed, that struggle became more painful. If she stayed, she would not only place herself in danger, but might also become the weakness that put him at risk, and the thought that her presence could harm the only person who had treated her with kindness was more than she could bear. But if she left, she would return once again to the loneliness she knew too well, and this time, she knew it would be colder than before, because now she knew what it felt like not to be alone, and a person cannot forget warmth once they have been warmed by it. She thought perhaps leaving without a word was the best way, the only way, because if she faced him, if she let him look into her eyes and ask her why, she feared she wouldn't have enough courage to walk away. She began quietly preparing, arranging the few things she owned, calculating where she might go, and every small act of that preparation made her chest tighten. She told herself she was doing this for him, to protect him from the very danger she had accidentally brought into his life, and that sometimes loving someone meant having to leave them. But even as she told herself that, she still knew, deep in her heart, that she was lying to herself in part, that she was also running because she was afraid of how much that man had come to matter to her, afraid of what would happen to her heart if she stayed, and then lost one more person. And so, with a heavy resolve and a broken heart, she decided that she would leave. Raphael knew about what was happening to Marin even before she fully understood it herself, because in his world, very few things could happen without reaching his ears, and when he pieced the scattered fragments together, he immediately understood the entire picture Lucan had carefully woven. He understood that the traitor had found his weakness, and that weakness was the woman he had allowed into the lonely nights of his life. The anger rising inside him was unlike any anger he had ever known, cold and deep, the anger of a man who had lost too much and now saw the last thing he had left being threatened. In the first instant, every instinct sharpened over so many years in the underworld urged him to answer in the only language that world understood, to find the man who had dared touch her and deal with him and everyone who stood with him in the most final, merciless way possible. He had enough power to do it, enough men, enough means, and he knew that if he unleashed his anger, there would be no one left who could speak his name without trembling. But then, right in the middle of that anger, something else held him back. He thought of her, of the way she had stood before Dorian and refused to lower her head, of the way she rejected every offer of help that came with conditions attached, of the self-respect she had preserved through everything life had thrown at her. He thought of how she had wished for him to find a place where he could truly rest, and he understood that if he let his anger turn him into the monster the world already believed him to be, then he would become exactly the kind of thing she, if she knew, would never be able to look at again. And for the first time in many years, he stopped before a line he once would have crossed without a moment's hesitation. There were ways for him to extinguish this threat, ways that would drag innocent people down with it, ways that would give him what he wanted but cost him the last remaining human part of himself, the very part she had awakened. He refused to take those paths. He decided that he would protect her, that he would trace the traitor and end his scheme. But he would do it without betraying the principle that had always separated him from those who were purely brutal, the principle that he only struck those who deserved to be struck, and never the innocent people trapped in between. It was a difficult choice, because it meant he would have to act with more precision and restraint. He would have to control his anger, instead of letting it lead him, would have to place her safety above even the craving for revenge roaring inside his chest. But he realized, with a clarity that surprised even him, that this was what he wanted to become. Not the man grief had made him after the loss of his son, but something closer to the father, who had once run after his child across a rooftop and pretended to be an airplane. He called the people he could still trust absolutely, a small group of men who had proven their loyalty over the years, and he began preparing quietly. He had people protect her from a distance, discreetly enough that she never knew, making sure that wherever she went, someone was always watching, so she wouldn't fall into the enemy's hands. At the same time, he began setting his own net, following every trace Lucan had tried to hide, patient and precise, determined to expose the traitor and protect the woman who had made his heart, once thought dead, begin beating again. He didn't know that while he was pouring all his strength into keeping her safe, she herself, because she wanted to protect him, was quietly preparing to disappear from his life. In the days that followed, Raphael worked with a cold concentration that even those closest to him rarely witnessed, following each thread in the web the traitor had spun, patiently loosening one knot after another, until the picture gradually came into focus before his eyes. He had every suspicious transaction checked again, every leaked meeting, every mismatched figure, and clue by clue, they all led in the same direction, toward the same man he had not wanted to believe was involved, but could no longer deny. When the name Lucan Brandt finally stood out clearly as the answer to everything, Raphael sat in silence for a long while, and inside that silence was a kind of pain he didn't allow himself to show. Lucan wasn't a stranger, wasn't an enemy from outside. Lucan was the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone else, the man to whom he had once given an almost absolute trust, the man he had once regarded as something close to a brother. Betrayal from someone like that cut deeper than any knife from an enemy, and Raphael, who had believed himself hardened against every form of betrayal, realized there were still wounds even he wasn't immune to. But the deeper he dug, the more he uncovered things that made the blood in his veins turn cold. As he traced Lucan's past, following the hidden operations he had taken part in over the previous years, Raphael began to touch something he had never expected, a faint thread connecting this traitor to the tragedy that had taken Marin's family from her 2 years earlier. He couldn't confirm every detail, and part of him didn't dare believe what he was piecing together. But what he found was enough to make him understand that Lucan, through his schemes and the intermediaries he used, had once been indirectly involved in the chain of events that pushed that woman into the tragedy of her life, long before either of them knew the other existed. That truth, though still unclear in places, brought Raphael a deep shock, because it meant his fate and hers had been woven together by the same man, the same source of darkness, long before destiny brought them to each other on an empty rooftop. He didn't let that shock throw him off course. If anything, it only made his resolve turn harder than steel. Now he wasn't only fighting to protect her from a present threat, but to close a circle of darkness that had lasted far too long, a circle into which he himself, without knowing it, had also been pulled. He began tightening the noose around Lucan, quietly and deliberately cutting off each of his escape routes, neutralizing the people Lucan had planted in key positions, winning back the loyalty of those who were still wavering, until the power the traitor had secretly accumulated began to crumble in his hands before he even realized it. But Lucan was no ordinary opponent. He had been in this world long enough to sense when the ground beneath his feet was beginning to shift. And when he realized that Raphael hadn't grown weak as he had mistakenly believed, that the man he intended to overthrow still possessed the same deadly sharpness of the old days, Lucan understood that his time was running out. Driven into a corner, he decided to play his final and most dangerous card, the card he had prepared in advance for exactly this situation. He decided that if he couldn't defeat Raphael through schemes, then he would force Raphael to his knees by striking at the one thing that man couldn't bear to lose. And so, while Raphael was tightening his own net, Lucan quietly ordered his men to act, aiming straight at Marin, turning the long-hidden struggle between them into a direct confrontation that both men knew only one of them would walk away from whole. Lucan's men found Marin on the evening she intended to leave the city, just as she had locked the door of her third-floor apartment for the last time, carrying a small bag that held everything she was taking with her. They stopped her before she could reach the main road, and this time there were no more polite warnings, only the cold brutality of men who had been ordered to take her away. She fought back. She screamed. She did everything a person in that desperate situation could do. But there were more of them, and they were stronger, and she was forced into a car and driven to an old warehouse on the edge of the city, where Lucan was waiting with the calm expression of a man who believed victory was already firmly in his hands. He watched her being brought in, and on his face was the smile of someone who believed he had finally obtained the decisive card that would force Raphael to surrender. But what Lucan had miscalculated, once again and for the last time, was the speed and extent of what Raphael was willing to do to save this woman, because the people Raphael had assigned to protect her in secret had never taken their eyes off her. And the moment she was taken, he knew, and he acted with a decisiveness Lucan had no time to anticipate. When the warehouse door burst open, not with a knock but with force, Raphael stepped inside with his most loyal men, and in that moment, the man whose name made the whole city hold its breath had returned in his fullest form. The confrontation unfolded quickly and chaotically. Lucan's men rushed in to stop them, and a struggle broke out in the dim, open space of the warehouse. Shadows colliding with one another, harsh sounds ringing out, decisive blows landing one after another. Raphael moved through that chaos with only one goal in his mind, to reach her, and nothing could stop him. He had spent his whole life in situations like this, but tonight there was something different. Tonight he wasn't fighting for power, or territory, or the survival of the organization. He was fighting for one person, and that was what made him impossible to stop. For the first time since losing his son, he placed his own life in danger, without the slightest hesitation, rushing into the heart of peril to protect someone else. And in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the feeling that his life once again held something worth risking everything for. Lucan, seeing the battle collapse around him, tried to use her as his final shield, tried to bargain, tried to threaten, but his voice had lost the cold confidence it had carried only moments earlier. Raphael advanced without flinching, and when the two men finally faced each other, one the betrayer and one the betrayed, a quiet and final reckoning passed between them, a reckoning after which Lucan was no longer in any position to threaten anyone again. When it was over, when the chaos had settled and Lucan's men had been completely subdued, Raphael crossed the now silent space toward Marin, who stood there trembling, still unable to believe what had just unfolded before her eyes. He stopped in front of her, and for one moment, they only looked at each other without speaking, every word made unnecessary by the weight of what had just happened. Then he reached out his hand, a hesitant gesture from a man unused to tenderness, and she stepped forward, falling into his arms. For the first time in 2 long years, she allowed herself to cry in someone else's embrace, allowed herself to be weak, allowed herself to believe that there was someone who wouldn't let her fall. He held her in the abandoned warehouse, one hand resting behind her head, and he whispered that she was safe now, that no one would ever be able to touch her again. And in that voice that was usually so cold, there was now a trembling he didn't even try to hide. A few nights after the storm had passed, When every danger had been extinguished, and the city had returned to its usual rhythm, Raphael brought Marin back to the rooftop, where everything had begun, the place where he had first seen her fallen asleep in the last chair. They stood beside each other in the night wind, looking down at the lights stretching far below, and this time there was no guardedness between them, no walls that needed to be raised. She asked him the question she had wanted to ask for a very long time, why he came back to this place every night, and this time he didn't avoid it. He told her, in a low and slow voice, about the son he had lost, about how this rooftop had once been the place where he heard his child's laughter, and about how after losing his son, he had closed off a part of himself because he didn't believe he had enough strength left to love and then lose again. He told her that through all those years, he had come up here every night not to find peace, but only to stay close to a memory, to remind himself that there had once been a time when he was a different man. Then he looked at her, and he said something he had never said to anyone, that the night he stepped outside and found her sleeping here, he had recognized in her a loneliness exactly like his own, and that she, without knowing it, had reminded him that pain wasn't something a person had to carry alone. She listened to him, and tears rolled down her cheeks, not because she was sad, but because she understood that two broken people had found each other in a vast and cold world, and that sometimes what saves us isn't strength, but allowing another person to step into the weakest parts of ourselves. In the months that followed, both their lives slowly changed in ways neither of them had once dared to imagine. The debt that had weighed on Marin's shoulders, the thing that had chained her to endless shifts, was finally untangled, not through a gift that forced her to lower her head, but in a way that respected her dignity. And for the first time in 2 years, she could breathe without feeling the weight of numbers pressing against her chest. She reduced her work hours, began sleeping enough, began finding again the small things she had forgotten she once loved, and the face that had always been marked by exhaustion gradually brightened with a light she herself had almost forgotten. As for Raphael, the man whose name had once made the whole city hold its breath, he too began a journey of change of his own. He began quietly withdrawing from the darkest parts of the world he had once ruled, undoing each tie that bound him to the shadows, not in one night, and not easily, but one step at a time, because he had found a reason to become a different man, a reason better than all the power he had ever held. He realized that what he had once believed was strength, the ability to make others afraid, had never truly filled the emptiness inside him, and that a small act of caring for another human being, and being cared for in return, was what finally brought him back to the human part of himself he had thought he had buried forever. And so, on the very rooftop that had once been a lonely refuge for both of them, they found something else now. Not a place to flee from loneliness anymore, but a place to begin again together. Their story is a reminder that quiet kindness, the kind of kindness that doesn't need to be seen and asks for nothing in return, has the power to save both the one who gives it and the one who receives it, and that no matter how much life takes from us, the possibility of healing still remains, as long as we are brave enough not to carry our pain alone. If this story has touched your heart, please click subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that every day we can keep listening together to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about Marin and Raphael's story, and what part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Wishing everyone listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.